in the golden light of dawn, breaking over Jerusalem's ancient stones, where the Temple of Solomon once stood in glory, a new brotherhood was about to emerge from the divine fervor of faith and the stark necessities of war. The year was 1119, and the Holy Land, recently wrested from Muslim control by the thundering armies of the First Crusade, lay vulnerable and bleeding. A prize too precious to lose, yet too vast and distant for the West to easily defend. The morning air carried the scent of frankincense from countless churches, mingling with the dust of rebuilding and the whispered prayers of pilgrims who had journeyed thousands of miles to walk where Christ himself had trod. Yet danger lurked in every shadow along the pilgrim roads. Bandits preyed upon the faithful, Muslim raiders struck at Christian settlements, and the thin line of Crusader knights scattered across the Levant seemed insufficient to protect the streams of European pilgrims who arrived with each passing season. It was in this crucible of devotion and desperation that 9 French knights, led by a nobleman from Champagne named Hugh de Payens, made a fateful decision. They would not return to the comfort and safety of their European estates, as so many crusaders had done after fulfilling their vows. Instead, they would remain in the Holy Land, dedicating their lives to the protection of Christian pilgrims and the defense of the sacred sites newly liberated from Islamic rule. These 9 men, Hugh de Payens, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, Payen de Montdidier, Geoffrey Bisson, Archambault de Saint-Agnan, Roland, Gondomar, and Rosal, were not merely warriors seeking glory or fortune. They were men touched by divine fire, moved by the profound spiritual experience of standing in the places where Christ had walked, where the apostles had preached, where Christian blood had been spilled for faith. The very stones of Jerusalem seemed to whisper of eternity, and these knights felt called to something greater than themselves. Their vow was simple, yet profound: to live as poor fellow soldiers of Christ, bound by monastic promises of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet trained in the arts of war and dedicated to the protection of Christian pilgrims traveling to and from the holy places. They would be monks and warriors, servants of God and masters of the sword, a revolutionary concept that would transform the very nature of medieval knighthood. Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, recognized the noble purpose of these knights and granted them quarters in the royal palace, situated on the Temple Mount where Solomon's temple had once risen in its magnificence. The knights established their headquarters in a wing of the complex that included the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders believed stood upon the ruins of the Temple of Solomon itself. From this sacred location, they took their name: the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. For 9 years, these knights labored in relative obscurity, their numbers few, their resources limited, their mission seemingly impossible. They patrolled the dangerous roads between the coast and Jerusalem, escort small groups of pilgrims, and gradually learned the harsh realities of warfare in a land where the sun burned mercilessly, where water was precious, and where enemies struck swiftly from desert wastes before vanishing like mirages. Yet their dedication did not go unnoticed. Word of their sacred mission began to spread throughout Europe, carried by returning pilgrims who spoke with wonder and gratitude of the knights who had protected them on their journey. Stories reached the great courts and monasteries of France, telling of men who had forsaken worldly ambition to serve Christ in the most dangerous and demanding of circumstances. In 1128, Hugh de Payens journeyed to Europe, not to abandon his mission, but to secure support for it. His arrival caused a sensation. Here was a man who embodied the highest ideals of medieval Christianity: noble birth wedded to monastic devotion, martial prowess dedicated to divine service. The response was extraordinary. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his age, became the Templars' greatest advocate. In his treatise, In Praise of the New Knighthood, Bernard declared that these warrior monks represented a new and perfect form of service to God. Where secular knights might sin through violence, pursued for personal glory or gain, the Templars fought only for Christ and the protection of the innocent. Their warfare was sanctified, their violence purified by their monastic vows and sacred purpose. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, Pope Honorius II formally recognized the Knights Templar as an official religious order of the Catholic Church. They received a written rule, based largely on the rule of Saint Benedict, but adapted for their unique military mission. The rule prescribed every aspect of their daily life: how they should pray, eat, sleep, fight, and conduct themselves in all circumstances. They were granted the right to wear white mantles, symbols of purity traditionally reserved for the Cistercian order, and later added the red cross that would become their most recognizable symbol. The response across Christian Europe was overwhelming. Nobles offered their sons to the order, churches collected donations for the Templars' mission, and rulers granted lands and privileges to support their work. The order that had begun with 9 knights in a ruined palace began to grow into something unprecedented. An international organization that answered to no king or prince, only to the Pope himself. Young men of noble birth flocked to join the order, drawn by the promise of serving God through disciplined warfare and monastic devotion. They came from France and England, Germany and Spain, Italy and Hungary, a diverse brotherhood united by common vows and shared purpose. Each new member brought not only his sword and skills, but also his family's wealth and influence, slowly transforming the poor fellow soldiers into one of the richest and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. The transformation was gradual but profound. What had begun as a small band of knights protecting pilgrims evolved into a vast network spanning from the Holy Land to the farthest reaches of Christian Europe. Commanderies, fortified monasteries that served as recruiting centers, training grounds, and administrative headquarters rose throughout the continent. In each, the same routine of prayer and preparation, devotion and discipline created a uniformity of purpose that transcended national boundaries and local loyalties. The rule governed every aspect of a Templar's life with meticulous precision. Knights were to hear Mass daily, recite prayers at prescribed hours, eat in silence, sleep in dormitories with oil lamps burning through the night. They were forbidden to hunt for pleasure, to dice or gamble, to kiss even their mothers or sisters. Their hair was to be cut short, their beards kept long. They could own nothing personally, all property belonged to the order. Even their clothing was regulated. White mantles for knights, brown or black for sergeants, the red cross marking them all as soldiers of Christ. Training was constant and rigorous. These were not merely knights who happened to be monks, but warriors trained to perfection in their deadly art. They practiced daily with sword and lance, learned to fight as disciplined units rather than individual heroes, and developed tactical innovations that would make them the most feared heavy cavalry of their age. Their horses were bred for war, armored and trained to be weapons in themselves. Their equipment was standardized and constantly improved through experience and innovation. As the order grew, so did its influence and reputation. Kings sought their counsel, popes granted them extraordinary privileges, and common folk regarded them with a mixture of awe and reverence. The Templars were answerable to no secular authority, exempt from local taxes and laws, free to cross any border in their service to Christ. They became a state within states, a power that transcended the normal boundaries of medieval politics and society. Yet beneath the growing magnificence and influence, the original spirit endured. At its heart, the order remained what it had begun as, a brotherhood of men who had given their lives completely to God, who saw their military service as a form of worship, and who were prepared to die rather than betray their sacred vows. Each morning, as the sun rose over their scattered commanderies and castles, the Templars would gather for prayer, reminding themselves that they were first and foremost servants of Christ, soldiers not of earthly kings, but of the King of Heaven. The fire that had been kindled in those first 9 nights had spread across Europe and the Holy Land, creating an organization unlike any the world had ever seen. Monk warriors who prayed with the devotion of contemplatives and fought with the ferocity of lions, the Knights Templar had become the perfect expression of medieval Christendom's highest ideals, and perhaps the seeds of its greatest tragedy. As the morning mist lifted from Jerusalem's golden stones, as the call to prayer echoed from their chapel bells, the Templars prepared for another day of service in a world where the sacred and the violent, the spiritual and the martial, the eternal and the temporal had become inseparably intertwined. They had been born from sacred fire, and in that fire they would live, fight, and if necessary, die for the glory of God and the protection of the faithful. Warriors of the White Mantle. From the dusty training yards of European commanderies to the sun-baked battlefields of Outremer, the Knights Templar forged themselves into the most disciplined and feared military force of the medieval world. They were warriors unlike any who had come before, men who combined the tactical precision of professional soldiers with the unwavering devotion of monks, creating a brotherhood that would revolutionize the very concept of warfare and knighthood. The transformation of young nobles into Templar knights was a process as rigorous as it was sacred. When a candidate presented himself at a commandery's gates, seeking admission to the order, he faced examination not only of his martial skills, but of his spiritual commitment, his noble lineage, and his willingness to surrender everything for the sake of the brotherhood. The order accepted only men of free birth, legitimate parentage, and sufficient physical strength to bear the weight of armor and the demands of combat. The initiation ceremony itself was shrouded in secrecy, conducted behind closed doors with only full members of the order present. Candidates swore the triple vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience that bound all religious orders, but with additional promises specific to their military calling. Never to retreat in battle unless outnumbered 3-1. Never to ask for ransom if captured. Never to surrender a Templar castle to the enemy. These vows were no mere formalities, but binding commitments that shaped every aspect of a Templar's existence until death. Once accepted, the new brother received the order's distinctive regalia, the white mantle that symbolized his purity of purpose, the red cross that marked him as a soldier of Christ, and the coif, a white cloth head covering worn beneath the helmet. Only knights of proven noble birth could wear the white mantle. Sergeants and other members of the order wore brown or black robes. This visual distinction reinforced the order's hierarchical structure while emphasizing the sacred nature of the knightly calling. Daily life within a Templar commandery followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork, balancing spiritual obligations with military training. The brothers rose before dawn for the service of matins, gathering in their chapel as the first light touched the horizon. Throughout the day, they observed the canonical hours, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, their prayers punctuating the rhythm of training, administrative duties, and communal meals. Meals were taken in silence, with one brother reading aloud from scripture or the lives of saints while the others ate. The food was simple, but nutritious. Bread, vegetables, some fruit, and meat only 3 times per week, unless they were actively campaigning. Wine was permitted, but carefully rationed. The rule specified that brothers should eat at long tables, maintaining their discipline even in the satisfaction of basic needs. Training consumed much of their time and energy. In the practice yards of their commanderies, Templars perfected the skills that made them masters of medieval warfare. They learned to fight not as individual heroes seeking personal glory, the common mode of secular knighthood, but as disciplined units whose coordinated actions multiplied their effectiveness beyond their actual numbers. The cornerstone of Templar military doctrine was the cavalry charge, the devastating assault by heavily armored knights on powerful war horses that could shatter enemy formations and turn the tide of battle in moments. But where secular knights often charged impetuously, seeking individual glory, the Templars developed tactics that emphasized timing, coordination, and disciplined execution. Their signature formation was the conroys, tight squadrons of 25 to 50 knights riding knee to knee, their lances leveled as one, thundering toward the enemy with a precision that maximized the devastating impact of their assault. Contemporary chronicles describe the terror inspired by these charges. The charging knight being able to punch a hole in the walls of Babylon, wrote one observer, while another noted that the Templars rode so close together that an apple thrown into their midst would not have touched the ground. The psychological impact of a Templar charge was as important as its physical force. Enemies faced not just a mass of armed men, but the embodiment of divine wrath, Warriors who showed no fear because they believed death in battle would earn them immediate entry into paradise. Their white mantles streaming behind them, red crosses blazing on their chests, the Templars struck their enemies like the very hand of God, implacable and irresistible. Training for such precision required constant practice. Knights learned to maintain perfect formation at full gallop, to coordinate their lance strikes for maximum impact, and to follow up their initial charge with sword work if the enemy line did not break immediately. They practiced until their movements became instinctive, until horse and rider functioned as a single instrument of war, guided by supernatural discipline. The Templars' equipment was standardized and constantly refined through practical experience. Each knight maintained multiple destriers, the powerful war horses bred specifically for cavalry combat. These animals were as carefully trained as their riders, taught to strike with their hooves, to respond to leg pressure when their riders' hands were occupied with weapons, and to remain steady in the chaos and noise of battle. Armor evolved throughout the Order's existence, always incorporating the latest developments in protection and mobility. Early Templars wore mail hauberks, shirts of interlocking iron rings that provided flexible protection, covered by their distinctive white surcoats bearing the red cross. Helmets progressed from simple conical designs to the great helms that enclosed the entire head, with narrow slits for vision and breathing holes to prevent suffocation in the heat of battle. Weapons were chosen for effectiveness rather than ornamentation. The lance, between 12 and 14 feet long and tipped with a sharp steel point, was the primary weapon for the initial charge. Once combat became close and personal, knights drew their swords, long straight blades designed for cutting rather than thrusting, capable of cleaving through mail and delivering devastating wounds to unarmored opponents. The Templars' tactical innovations extended beyond individual combat techniques to strategic thinking that revolutionized medieval warfare. They were among the first to understand the importance of logistics, the unglamorous but vital work of ensuring that armies remained supplied, healthy, and combat-ready throughout long campaigns. Their international network of commanderies created a supply chain that could maintain operations across vast distances for extended periods. Castle construction and siege warfare were other areas where Templar expertise proved invaluable. As they acquired strongholds throughout the Holy Land and Europe, they developed sophisticated techniques for fortification, creating defensive systems that could withstand prolonged attack while serving as bases for offensive operations. Castles like Chastel Blanc and Tortosa in Syria became legendary for their impregnability and strategic importance. The Order's approach to recruitment and training created unprecedented military effectiveness. Unlike feudal armies that gathered temporarily for specific campaigns, the Templars maintained permanent readiness. Their knights lived together, trained together, and fought together year after year, developing a cohesion and mutual trust impossible to achieve in conventional military forces. Discipline distinguished the Templars from other knights as much as their religious vows. Where secular knights might break formation to pursue individual enemies or seek personal glory, Templars maintained their ranks and followed orders with monastic obedience. This discipline made them invaluable as shock troops, capable of delivering devastating attacks precisely when and where commanders needed them most. Their reputation for military excellence attracted the attention of kings and military leaders throughout Europe and the Holy Land. Templar knights served as tactical advisors, their expertise sought by rulers who recognized that these warrior monks understood warfare in ways that traditional feudal knights didn't. Their presence in an army was often enough to boost morale among allies and strike fear into enemies. The Templars' military innovations influenced warfare far beyond their own ranks. Other military orders, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the orders created in Spain during the Reconquista, adopted many Templar practices. Secular armies began to emphasize discipline and coordination over individual heroics. The age of the wild, undisciplined knight began to give way to more professional military practices. Yet, for all their martial prowess, the Templars never forgot that they were first and foremost religious men. Before each battle, they attended Mass and received the sacraments. They fought not for personal glory or material gain, but for the glory of God and the defense of Christendom. This spiritual dimension of their warfare gave them a steadiness and determination that purely secular warriors could rarely match. As evening shadows fell across their training yards, as weapons were cleaned and stored for another day's practice, the Templars would gather once more in prayer, thanking God for the strength to serve Him and asking for the courage to face whatever battles tomorrow might bring. They were warriors forged in the white heat of faith and discipline, tempested in the furnace of constant training and unwavering devotion. The white mantles that marked them as soldiers of Christ would become symbols of terror to their enemies and hope to their allies, worn by men who had transformed themselves into instruments of divine will through relentless preparation and absolute commitment to their sacred calling. In them, the medieval ideal of the Christian knight found its most perfect and terrible expression. Guardians of the sacred land. In the shimmering heat of the Levantine sun, where ancient olive groves crowned limestone hills and the calls of muezzins echoed across valleys scattered with biblical stones, the Knights Templar stood as the final guardians of Christian presence in the Holy Land. For nearly 2 centuries, they would wage an epic struggle to maintain the precarious Crusader kingdoms, building mighty fortresses, fighting desperate battles, and writing their legacy in blood and stone across the sacred landscape where 3 great faiths converged. The Holy Land that the Templars inherited after the First Crusade was a complex mosaic of competing powers, shifting alliances, and precarious territorial arrangements. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli stretched along the eastern Mediterranean coast and inland toward the Syrian desert. But they remained islands of Christian rule in a predominantly Muslim sea. These territories were never secure. Muslim forces controlled the great cities of Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, while nomadic tribes raided constantly from the desert margins. The Crusader population was always vastly outnumbered by their Muslim neighbors, and the supply of reinforcements from Europe was irregular and often inadequate. In this dangerous environment, the military orders, and the Templars foremost among them, became the backbone of Christian defense. The Templars' first major fortress was the castle of Gaston, granted to them in 1129. But it was with their acquisition of other strongholds, Bagras, Tortosa, Safita, and eventually the massive complex at Athlit, that they began to create a defensive network that would define Crusader military strategy for generations. Each castle was positioned to control key routes, protect vital resources, or dominate strategic territories. Crac des Chevaliers, though held by the Hospitallers, exemplified the kind of fortress architecture that the military orders perfected during this period. These were not merely defensive positions, but complex military administrative centers that could house hundreds of knights and soldiers, maintain extensive stables and armories, and control surrounding territories through a combination of military patrols and economic influence. The Templars approached castle construction with the same methodical precision they brought to military training. Their fortresses combined the latest European architectural innovations with adaptations to local conditions and threats. Massive walls, multiple defensive lines, sophisticated water systems, and carefully planned killing zones created strongholds that could withstand prolonged siege while serving as bases for offensive operations. Daily life in a Templar castle in the Holy Land differed markedly from the routine of European commanderies. Here, the brothers lived in constant readiness for combat, their prayers punctuated by the sounds of weapons being sharpened, and scouts returning with intelligence about enemy movements. The heat was oppressive, water was precious, and the threat of attack was never absent. The chapel remained the heart of each fortress, but it was a chapel built like a bunker, with thick walls that could resist catapult stones and narrow windows that served as defensive positions. Here, the Templars gathered for their daily offices, their voices rising in Latin hymns, while their weapons lay close at hand, ready to be seized at the first sound of alarm. The brothers who served in these eastern strongholds developed a deep knowledge of local conditions, customs, and languages. Many learned Arabic and developed relationships with their Muslim neighbors that transcended the simple hostility that characterized much of Crusader Muslim interaction. They understood that survival in the Holy Land required not only military prowess, but diplomatic skill, tactical patience, and careful attention to the complex web of alliances that characterized Middle Eastern politics. This practical wisdom sometimes put the Templars at odds with newly arrived crusaders from Europe, who often arrived filled with religious enthusiasm but lacking understanding of local realities. The Templars had learned that not every Muslim was an implacable enemy, that tactical withdrawals were sometimes necessary for long-term survival, and that the resources of the Crusader states were too limited to waste on hopeless ventures. The Order's military reputation was forged in countless engagements across the Holy Land. At the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, some 500 Templar knights helped King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem achieve one of the most stunning victories in Crusader history, defeating Saladin's much larger army through superior tactics and unflinching courage. The Muslim chroniclers themselves paid tribute to the Templars' fighting qualities, describing how their disciplined charges broke through formations that had seemed impregnable. Yet the Templars also experienced devastating defeats. At the Horns of Hattin in 1187, poor leadership and tactical errors led to the destruction of the largest Crusader army ever assembled, with most of the Templar knights present being killed or captured. Saladin, recognizing the particular threat posed by the military orders, ordered the execution of captured Templars and Hospitallers, while sparing other prisoners who might be ransomed. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 marked a fundamental shift in the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The city that had been the spiritual and symbolic heart of the Crusader states fell to Saladin's forces, and though the Third Crusade under Richard the Lionheart reclaimed much territory along the coast, Jerusalem itself remained in Muslim hands. The Templars established new headquarters at Acre, adapting to the reality that their mission had become one of preservation rather than expansion. Throughout these turbulent decades, the Templars maintained their commitment to their original purpose, protecting Christian pilgrims. Even as the political situation deteriorated, streams of European pilgrims continued to arrive in the Holy Land, seeking to visit the sacred sites associated with Christ's life and death. The Templars provided armed escorts, safe lodging, and detailed knowledge of routes and dangers, ensuring that the pilgrimage tradition could continue despite the military upheavals. The Order's expertise in siege warfare proved invaluable throughout the period. They understood the science of undermining walls, the construction and operation of siege engines, and the psychological warfare that could break a city's will to resist. Their engineers developed innovations in military architecture and siege technology that influenced fortress design throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world. The Templars also became masters of naval warfare, maintaining fleets that could transport troops and supplies, raid enemy coastlines, and maintain communications between the Holy Land and Europe. Their ships carried not only warriors and weapons, but also the letters, reports, and financial instruments that kept their international organization functioning across vast distances. As the 13th century progressed, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land contracted steadily under relentless Muslim pressure. The rise of the Mamluks in Egypt brought new military pressures and a systematic campaign to eliminate Christian strongholds. One by one, the great Crusader cities and fortresses fell. Antioch in 1268, Crac des Chevaliers in 1271, Tripoli in 1289. The final act of the Crusader drama in the Holy Land played out at Acre, where the Templars made their last desperate stand. The siege of Acre in 1291 saw the cream of the military orders fighting with hopeless courage against overwhelming odds. When the city's walls were finally breached, the Templars retreated to their massive fortress temple, continuing to resist even as the rest of the city fell around them. The last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land collapsed on May 28, 1291, taking with it nearly 2 centuries of Christian presence in the Levant. The Grand Master died in the final assault, along with most of the Order's leadership and many of its finest knights. Those who survived faced the bitter task of evacuating to Cyprus, leaving behind the sacred land they had sworn to defend. Yet even in defeat, the Templars had fulfilled their essential mission. For 200 years, they had maintained Christian access to the Holy Land, protected countless thousands of pilgrims, and created a legacy of military and architectural innovation that would influence warfare for centuries to come. They had been the guardians of the sacred land, and though that land had ultimately been lost, their guardianship had enabled generations of Christians to walk where Christ had walked, to pray where he had prayed, and to draw spiritual sustenance from the very stones of the holy city. As the last Templar ships departed from the Palestinian coast, their white sails disappearing into the sunset beyond Acre's burning harbour, an era ended. But the spirit that had driven men to give their lives for the defence of sacred places, the ideal of the warrior monk serving God through disciplined warfare, and the innovations in military science and organization that the Templars had pioneered would endure long after their strongholds had crumbled into ruins beneath the Palestinian sun. The sacred land that had witnessed their greatest triumphs and ultimate defeat would remember them. In the massive stones of their castles, in the legends told by local inhabitants, and in the geographic names that preserved the memory of the white-mantled knights who had been its guardians for so many turbulent, heroic years. The temple's treasury. Far from the dust and heat of Palestinian battlefields, in the stone-walled counting houses of Paris and London, the Brothers of the Temple were pioneering a different kind of revolution. While their military prowess earned them fame on crusade, it was their mastery of finance and commerce that would make them one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, and ultimately contribute to their spectacular downfall. The transformation of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ into Europe's premier banking institution began with practical necessity. The costs of maintaining knights, horses, and equipment in the Holy Land, combined with the expense of transporting men and supplies across thousands of miles, created financial challenges that required innovative solutions. The Templars' response to these challenges would revolutionize medieval commerce and create the foundation of modern banking. The Order's earliest financial activities grew naturally from their charitable mission. European nobles who took crusading vows often needed to liquidate assets quickly to fund their expeditions, while those who remained behind sought secure repositories for their valuables. The Templars' reputation for integrity and their network of commanderies across Europe made them ideal custodians of such wealth. By the middle of the 12th century, the Templars had developed sophisticated financial instruments that facilitated trade and travel across vast distances. A merchant in London could deposit silver with the Templars and receive a coded letter that would allow him to withdraw equivalent value in gold at a Templar house in Jerusalem, eliminating the risks and costs of transporting precious metals across dangerous territories. This system of credit transfers, essentially the world's first international banking network, revolutionized medieval commerce. Pilgrims and merchants no longer needed to carry large sums of money on dangerous journeys. Traders could conduct business across international borders with unprecedented ease, and the flow of capital throughout Europe increased dramatically. The Templars' London Temple became the de facto treasury of the English crown, with kings regularly depositing their revenues and borrowing against future income. The Master of the Temple in London served as an unofficial royal treasurer, managing crown finances with expertise that no royal official could match. Similar relationships developed with monarchs throughout Europe, making the Templars indispensable to royal administration and international diplomacy. Their financial innovations extended beyond simple banking services. The Templars developed complex investment instruments, funded commercial ventures, and provided mortgage services that enabled large-scale construction projects. They financed cathedral building campaigns, underwrote trading expeditions, and provided the capital that fueled Europe's economic expansion during the High Middle Ages. The Order's accounting methods were remarkably sophisticated for their time. They maintained detailed records of all transactions, tracked interest payments and investment returns, and developed auditing procedures that ensured financial integrity across their international network. Their ledgers, written in a coded script known only to authorized personnel, recorded millions of transactions in currencies from across the known world. Temple churches in major cities became centers of international finance, where merchants, nobles, and royal representatives conducted business in an atmosphere of scrupulous honesty and professional competence. The Templars' reputation for financial integrity was so absolute that their letters of credit were accepted without question from Lisbon to Constantinople, from London to Acre. The source of the Templars' enormous wealth was diverse and carefully managed. Donations from pious Europeans continued throughout the Order's existence, but increasingly their income derived from rents on vast landed estates, returns on commercial investments, and fees for financial services. They owned thousands of properties across Europe: farms, vineyards, mills, forests, urban real estate, and entire villages that provided steady rental income. Their estates were managed with the same efficiency that characterized their military operations. Templar agricultural techniques were often the most advanced available. Their livestock breeding programs produced superior animals, and their wine-making operations became renowned for quality and innovation. The wool from Templar sheep in England was considered among the finest in Europe, while their vineyards in France and Spain produced wines that graced royal tables. Trade was another major source of wealth. The Templars' ships carried more than soldiers and pilgrims. They transported luxury goods from the east, raw materials from the west, and agricultural products between their scattered properties. Their fleet gave them significant advantages in international commerce, while their financial expertise enabled them to dominate lucrative trade routes. The Order's relationship with secular authorities became increasingly complex as their wealth and influence grew. Kings appreciated the Templars' financial services and relied on their expertise, but they also grew wary of an organization that answered to no earthly sovereign and controlled resources that rivaled royal treasuries. The Templars' international character made them particularly valuable and particularly threatening to monarchs seeking to consolidate royal power. In France, Philip IV found himself increasingly dependent on Templar financial services, while simultaneously resenting their independence and coveting their wealth. The order had become the crown's primary creditor, holding mortgages on royal lands and providing the credit that enabled royal administration to function. Yet the same financial power that made them indispensable also made them dangerous to a king seeking absolute sovereignty. The Templars' privileged legal status added another layer of complexity to their relationships with secular authorities. Papal bulls had granted them exemption from local taxes, freedom from secular jurisdiction, and the right to conduct their own courts. These privileges, originally intended to facilitate their holy mission, gradually became sources of friction with local bishops, royal officials, and municipal authorities, who saw the Templars as arrogant and self-serving. Their reputation for financial acumen attracted some of Europe's most capable administrators to their ranks. Templar treasurers and financial officers often possessed skills superior to those of royal officials, making the order an attractive career choice for talented men seeking advancement beyond the limitations of feudal society. This influx of administrative talent further enhanced the order's effectiveness, but also contributed to perceptions that they had abandoned their original spiritual mission. The complexity of Templar financial operations required sophisticated communication networks and administrative procedures. Coded messages traveled regularly between commanderies, carrying instructions about investments, reports on local conditions, and intelligence about political and economic developments. This information network gave the Templars advantages in both financial markets and political negotiations that their rivals could rarely match. Their financial innovations influenced commercial practices throughout Europe. The concept of credit transfer, standardized accounting procedures, international letters of credit, and professional banking services spread from Templar houses to secular merchants and Italian banking houses that would dominate later medieval finance. In many ways, the Templars laid the groundwork for the commercial revolution that would transform Europe in the later Middle Ages. Yet the order's financial success also contained the seeds of its destruction. Wealth bred suspicion, independence created resentment, and the very success of their innovations made them appear dangerous to authorities who could not control them. Kings and princes who had initially welcomed Templar financial services gradually came to view the order as a threat to royal sovereignty and national independence. By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar had become victims of their own success. Their financial empire stretched across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their political influence rivaled that of kings, and their military reputation remained formidable despite the loss of the Holy Land. They had transcended their original role as protectors of pilgrims to become a power unto themselves, a development that would ultimately prove fatal. The temple's treasury had grown beyond all expectation, transforming a small band of warrior monks into an international organization of unprecedented wealth and influence. But in medieval Europe, power that could not be controlled was power that invited destruction, and the very financial innovations that had made the Templars indispensable would soon make them intolerable to those who sought absolute dominion over Christian Europe. As the 13th century drew to a close, the silver and gold flowing through Templar counting houses would soon be overshadowed by the dark schemes of those who coveted their wealth and feared their independence. The temple that had been built on spiritual foundations would face its greatest test, not on the battlefield where they had earned glory, but in the counting houses where they had accumulated power that their enemies could no longer ignore or tolerate. The dark before dawn. In the pre-dawn darkness of Friday, October 13th, 1307, throughout the Kingdom of France, royal agents moved with silent purpose to predetermined destinations. In their hands were sealed letters bearing the commands of Philip IV, the Iron King, whose iron will had shaped France into the most powerful monarchy in Europe. By sunrise, the most dramatic and ruthless blow ever struck against a religious order would be complete, beginning a tragic chapter that would destroy the Knights Templar and cast a dark shadow across the medieval world. The roots of this catastrophe stretched back years, growing from a complex web of political ambition, financial desperation, and the dangerous intersection of temporal power with spiritual authority. Philip IV of France, tall, handsome, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of royal supremacy, had spent his reign systematically destroying any force that might challenge the absolute sovereignty he claimed as his divine right. The Templars represented everything Philip despised and feared about the old medieval order. They answered to the Pope rather than to him. They commanded wealth that rivaled his own treasury. They maintained armed forces that moved freely across his borders. Most galling of all, they held mortgages on royal lands and regularly reminded the king of his debts to their order. For a monarch determined to establish the principle that within France the king was emperor, the Templars' independence was intolerable. The relationship between the French crown and the order had deteriorated steadily throughout Philip's reign. What had once been a partnership based on mutual benefit had soured into suspicion and resentment. The Templars' arrogance, for they had indeed grown proud in their power and wealth, combined with Philip's paranoid desire for absolute control to create an explosive situation that needed only a spark to ignite it. That spark came with the Order's vulnerability following the loss of the Holy Land. With Acre fallen and the Crusader states destroyed, the Templars' original mission appeared obsolete. Their enemies could argue that these warrior monks had outlived their purpose, that their wealth and privileges were no longer justified by service to Christendom. Plans for new crusades remained theoretical, and public enthusiasm for expensive Eastern adventures had waned considerably. Philip's campaign against the Templars began with subtle propaganda designed to undermine their reputation and prepare public opinion for more drastic action. Rumors circulated throughout France suggesting that the order harbored dark secrets, that their initiation ceremonies involved blasphemous practices, that their wealth had corrupted their spiritual mission. Former members, expelled from the order for various infractions, were encouraged to come forward with lurid tales of heresy and perversion. The accusations that would eventually be leveled against the Templars formed a catalogue of medieval fears and fantasies: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, obscene rituals, worship of a demonic idol called Baphomet, and homosexual practices among the brothers. These charges were carefully crafted to shock medieval sensibilities while remaining vague enough to be difficult to disprove. They combined religious horror with sexual anxiety in ways calculated to generate maximum revulsion. Behind the theological accusations lay more practical concerns. Philip needed money, vast amounts of it, to fund his wars, his administration, and his grand architectural projects. The royal treasury was chronically empty, while the Templars' wealth seemed inexhaustible. If the order could be destroyed and its assets seized, Philip's financial problems would be solved at a stroke. The charges of heresy provided a convenient legal mechanism for accomplishing this seizure, while appearing to defend the faith. The king's principal instrument in this campaign was Guillaume de Nogaret, his chancellor and one of the most ruthless political operators of the medieval period. Nogaret had already demonstrated his willingness to use any means necessary in service of royal power when he orchestrated the humiliation of Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni, effectively destroying papal pretensions to supremacy over secular monarchs. The destruction of the Templars would be his masterpiece. Preparations for the strike were conducted with meticulous secrecy. Royal agents throughout France received sealed instructions that were not to be opened until October 12th. Lists were compiled of Templar properties to be seized, knights to be arrested, and evidence to be collected. The operation required coordination across the entire kingdom, involving hundreds of officials and thousands of soldiers. Yet somehow no word of the impending action reached the Templars themselves. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Order, was in France during these crucial months, negotiating with the Pope about plans for a new crusade, and seemingly unaware of the danger gathering around him. The 70-year-old veteran of numerous Eastern campaigns had spent his life in service to the Order and appeared genuinely shocked when accusations of heresy began to surface. His responses to the charges were defensive but unfocused, lacking the political sophistication necessary to counter Philip's carefully orchestrated campaign. Pope Clement V found himself caught between his theoretical authority over the Templars and the practical power of the French king, who controlled the territories where the papal court resided. Clement, a weak man who owed his election partly to Philip's influence, proved incapable of providing the strong leadership that might have saved the order. His attempts at compromise satisfied no one and ultimately enabled Philip's more decisive action. When dawn broke on October 13th, 1307, the blow fell with stunning swiftness and completeness. Across France, royal agents simultaneously appeared at every Templar commandery, castle, and urban house, bearing royal warrants for the arrest of all members of the order. The Templars, caught completely off guard, offered no significant resistance. They were taken into custody, their properties sealed, their treasure confiscated, and their members marched away to imprisonment and interrogation. The psychological impact of this coordinated assault was enormous. The Templars, who had seemed so powerful, so wealthy, so secure in their papal protection, were revealed to be as vulnerable as any other group when royal power was exercised with sufficient determination and planning. The arrests sent shockwaves throughout Europe, demonstrating that no organization, however prestigious or well-connected, was safe from the wrath of a determined monarch. The interrogations that followed were conducted with medieval thoroughness and brutality. Torture was applied systematically to extract confessions from the imprisoned Templars, with techniques ranging from foot roasting to the strappado, suspending victims by their arms, twisted behind their backs. Under such pressure, many Templars confessed to at least some of the charges against them, providing Philip with the evidence he needed to justify his actions. Yet the confessions extracted under torture were contradictory and unconvincing to many contemporary observers. Some Templars confessed to spitting on the cross during their initiation, others denied it completely. Stories about the mysterious idol Baphomet varied wildly in detail. Many of the accused retracted their confessions when they appeared before papal commissioners, claiming they had lied only to escape further torture. The trials that began in 1308 became a complex legal and political battle, fought simultaneously in royal courts, papal tribunals, and the court of public opinion. Philip's agents worked tirelessly to present evidence of Templar guilt, while the order's defenders, who were few and increasingly cautious, attempted to demonstrate the fabricated nature of the charges. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, complicated by jurisdictional disputes and the reluctance of authorities outside France to accept Philip's version of events. Other European monarchs watched the French assault on the Templars with mixed feelings. Some, like Edward II of England, were initially reluctant to move against an order that had served their kingdoms faithfully. Others saw an opportunity to seize Templar wealth for their own purposes. Gradually, however, the pressure of papal commands and French diplomatic influence led most rulers to arrest their own Templars and begin similar proceedings. The order's international structure, which had been its greatest strength, now became a fatal weakness. With the Grand Master and most senior leaders imprisoned in France, effective coordination of resistance became impossible. Individual commanderies and national branches of the order were left to fend for themselves, often facing hostile authorities with no central guidance or support. As the trials proceeded, the fate of individual Templars varied dramatically depending on their location and the temperament of their judges. In France, where Philip's influence was strongest, many knights were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics when they retracted confessions made under torture. In other countries, Templars were often permitted to join other religious orders or return to secular life after formal penance. The most tragic figure in this unfolding drama was Jacques de Molay himself. The elderly Grand Master endured years of imprisonment and interrogation, initially confessing under torture, but later recanting and defending the order's innocence. His final act of defiance came on March 18, 1314, when he was brought before Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris to receive his sentence. Expected to confirm his confession and accept perpetual imprisonment, de Molay instead proclaimed the order's innocence and his own willingness to die for the truth. Philip's response was swift and merciless. That very evening, de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, were burned alive on a small island in the Seine, their deaths witnessed by crowds that included many who had once honored them as heroes of Christendom. Legend would later claim that de Molay, as the flames rose around him, called down divine judgment upon his persecutors, a curse that seemed to find fulfillment when both Philip IV and Pope Clement V died within months of the Grand Master's execution. The formal dissolution of the order came with Pope Clement's bull Vox in Excelso on March 22, 1312. Issued at the Council of Vienne, the bull abolished the Templars not because they had been proven guilty of heresy, but because their reputation had been so damaged that they could no longer effectively fulfill their mission. It was a legal fiction that satisfied no one, but provided a face-saving formula for ending an intractable situation. The distribution of Templar assets proved as contentious as their seizure had been. The papal bull Ad Providam theoretically transferred most Templar property to the Hospitallers, but in practice, much of the order's wealth was retained by secular rulers who claimed compensation for the costs of the trials and investigations. Philip IV, despite his protestations of religious motivation, kept extensive Templar properties in France, while other monarchs followed similar policies in their own territories. The human cost of the Templars' destruction was enormous, but difficult to calculate precisely. Hundreds of knights died in prison, under torture, or at the stake. Thousands more saw their lives destroyed as they were forced from an order that had been their entire world. The broader damage to the medieval ideal of the warrior monk was incalculable, as cynicism replaced the idealism that had once inspired the military orders. Yet even in destruction, elements of the Templar legacy survived. In Portugal, King Denis refused to suppress the order completely, instead transforming it into the Order of Christ that would play a crucial role in Portuguese maritime exploration. Some Templars found refuge in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce's excommunication provided protection from papal authority. Others joined secular knightly orders or continued their traditions in forms that would eventually influence the development of Freemasonry and other fraternal organizations. The fall of the Knights Templar marked the end of an era in medieval history. The ideal of the warrior monk fighting for spiritual rather than material goals had been tainted by accusations of corruption and heresy. The international religious order, answerable to papal rather than royal authority, had been proven vulnerable to determined royal action. The medieval synthesis of faith and warfare, which had seemed so natural to earlier generations, began to fragment as secular and religious authorities pursued increasingly divergent paths. As the last echoes of the scandal faded, as the final trials concluded and the remaining properties were distributed, Europe emerged into a new age where royal power had been demonstrated to trump even the most prestigious religious authority. The dark before dawn had passed, but the dawn that followed illuminated a world where the old certainties had been shattered and new forms of power were struggling to be born. The white mantles that had once struck terror into Muslim hearts and inspired Christian reverence were gone forever, burned with their wearers, or hidden away by survivors who dared not reveal their former allegiance. In their place remained only memories, legends, and the enduring questions about what the Knights Templar had truly been, and what forces had been powerful enough to destroy them so completely and so finally. Echoes of Eternity. In the centuries that followed the flames of Paris, where Jacques de Molay met his martyr's death on that cold March evening in 1314, the Knights Templar passed from history into legend, from documented fact into the realm of mystery and speculation. Yet, like smoke from those final fires, their memory drifted across the ages, settling into the consciousness of generations who would find in the Templars' story a mirror for their own struggles between faith and power, idealism and corruption, sacrifice and betrayal. The immediate aftermath of the Order's destruction revealed the true extent of their integration into European society. Templar churches stood empty across the continent, their distinctive round naves, built in imitation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, bearing witness to a spiritual vision that had transcended national boundaries. Templar estates, numbering in the thousands, passed into new hands that often proved less capable administrators than the methodical brothers who had managed them for generations. The financial innovations that the Templars had pioneered continued to evolve in other hands. Italian banking houses adopted and refined the credit instruments and international transfer systems that Templar treasurers had developed. The concept of international banking, of financial networks that transcended political boundaries, had been proven viable by the Order's 2-century success, a legacy that would eventually contribute to the commercial revolution of the later Middle Ages. In England, the Temple Church in London remained a poignant reminder of the Order's former grandeur. Built in the distinctive round style and containing the effigy tombs of prominent Templars, it served as a mausoleum for more than individual knights. It was a monument to the entire ideal of the warrior monk that had inspired medieval Christendom. Visitors would come to see these stone figures, their hands clasped in prayer, their swords at their sides, representing a synthesis of martial and spiritual values that seemed increasingly remote from later ages. Portugal provided the most successful example of Templar continuity. King Denis's transformation of the Portuguese Templars into the Order of Christ not only preserved their traditions, but enabled them to play crucial roles in the maritime explorations that would expand European horizons. Prince Henry the Navigator was a member of the Order of Christ, and the distinctive cross that marked Portuguese exploration, from the African coast to the shores of India and Brazil, was the same red cross that had adorned Templar mantles in the Holy Land. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by the Sinclair family in the 15th century, became another focus for Templar legends. Its elaborate stone carvings, combining Christian symbolism with botanical motifs and geometric patterns, were interpreted by later generations as encoding secret Templar knowledge. While scholarly consensus suggests no direct Templar involvement in the chapel's construction, the legends surrounding it demonstrate the enduring appeal of the idea that the Order's wisdom had survived its political destruction. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in the Templars as humanist scholars rediscovered medieval texts and began to study the order's history with greater critical attention. The emerging printing press made previously rare documents more widely available, enabling broader examination of the charges against the Templars and the circumstances of their trials. Many Renaissance intellectuals concluded that the order had been the victim of political persecution rather than guilty of genuine heresy. During the Reformation, Protestant writers found in the Templars' story a useful precedent for their own conflicts with papal authority. The order's destruction could be presented as evidence of Catholic corruption and the dangers of unchecked ecclesiastical power. Catholic counter-Reformation writers, conversely, tended to emphasize the Templars' moral failings as justification for their suppression, seeing in their fate a warning about the spiritual dangers of excessive wealth and worldly involvement. The Enlightenment brought a different perspective to Templar studies, as rationalist thinkers examined the order's financial innovations and international organization with admiration rather than suspicion. Voltaire and other philosophers saw in the Templars an example of the kind of rational, efficient organization that could transcend the petty nationalisms and religious prejudices that plagued 18th century Europe. Their destruction was viewed as a triumph of superstition and royal tyranny over progress and enlightenment. It was during this period that the Templars began their most surprising afterlife, as inspiration for Freemasonry and other secret societies that claimed descent from the medieval order. The Masonic Knights Templar degree, developed in the 18th century, presented its initiates as inheritors of Templar traditions and wisdom. While historians have found no credible evidence of direct continuity between the medieval order and modern Freemasonry, the symbolic connection proved enormously powerful and persistent. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century found in the Templars perfect subjects for its fascination with medieval chivalry, secret knowledge, and tragic heroism. Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe popularized a romanticized image of the Templars that combined their historical military prowess with fictional elements of mystery and moral ambiguity. The figure of the Templar knight, proud, mysterious, potentially dangerous, became a stock character in Romantic literature. Archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries added new dimensions to Templar studies. Excavations at Templar sites revealed the sophistication of their architectural and engineering achievements, while documentary research in European archives uncovered thousands of previously unknown Templar records. These findings enabled more accurate assessment of the order's actual practices and beliefs, generally supporting the conclusion that the charges of heresy had been fabricated for political purposes. The 20th century witnessed an explosion of popular interest in Templar mysteries, fueled by best-selling novels, documentary films, and amateur historians who proposed increasingly elaborate theories about the order's secret knowledge and hidden treasures. Books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code introduced millions of readers to speculative theories about Templar involvement in preserving dangerous religious secrets or discovering mystical knowledge in the Holy Land. While academic historians remained skeptical of such theories, the popular fascination they generated reflected enduring human attraction to the idea that history's official narratives might conceal deeper truths. The Templars' documented secrecy about their initiation ceremonies, combined with their sudden destruction, created a void that speculation and imagination eagerly filled. Modern archaeological work at Templar sites has revealed the Order's genuine achievements and innovations. Excavations at Atlit Castle in Israel have uncovered the sophistication of Templar military engineering, while studies of their European commanderies have demonstrated their contributions to agricultural and commercial development. The reality of Templar accomplishments, while perhaps less exotic than popular theories suggest, remains impressive and historically significant. Contemporary scholarship has also provided clearer understanding of the political and economic factors that led to the Order's destruction. Philip IV's campaign against the Templars is now recognized as part of a broader assertion of royal sovereignty against international religious authority, a trend that would culminate in the establishment of national churches and the decline of papal temporal power. The Templar legacy in international law and finance continues to receive scholarly attention. Their development of letters of credit, standardized accounting procedures, and international financial networks established precedents that influenced subsequent commercial law and banking practices. Their impact on the development of international organizations, entities that operate across national boundaries while maintaining unified governance, remains relevant to modern studies of globalization and international cooperation. Religious communities have also found continuing inspiration in the Templar ideal of combining active service with contemplative devotion. Modern military chaplaincies, religious orders dedicated to social service, and faith-based humanitarian organizations often trace their spiritual lineage to the medieval military orders, seeing in the Templars' example a model for engaging worldly challenges while maintaining spiritual commitment. The Templars' architectural legacy endures in the numerous churches, castles, and other buildings they constructed across Europe and the Holy Land. Many of these structures remain in use centuries after their builder's destruction, testament to the quality of Templar craftsmanship and engineering. The distinctive round churches, built in imitation of the Holy Sepulchre, continue to serve Christian communities, their very form preserving memory of the Order's originating mission. Educational institutions throughout Europe and the Americas bear Templar names or claim inspiration from the Order's commitment to learning and preservation of knowledge. Universities, libraries, and research institutions invoke the Templars' example as guardians of wisdom and defenders of intellectual freedom against political oppression and religious fanaticism. The moral questions raised by the Templars' story remain relevant to contemporary discussions about the relationship between religious faith and political power, the responsibilities of wealth and privilege, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Their rise and fall provide case studies for ethicists, political scientists, and historians, examining how noble ideals can be corrupted by success and how powerful institutions can be destroyed by determined enemies. As the 21st century progresses, new technologies enable fresh approaches to Templar studies. Digital archives make previously inaccessible documents available to researchers worldwide, while advanced archaeological techniques reveal new details about Templar sites and artifacts. Computer modeling allows historians to reconstruct Templar financial networks and analyze their economic impact with unprecedented precision. Popular culture continues to find inspiration in Templar themes, with video games, television series, and films regularly featuring the Order as a mysterious force operating behind historical events. These contemporary interpretations, while often historically inaccurate, demonstrate the enduring power of the Templar story to capture imagination and provoke speculation about hidden forces shaping human events. The questions that the Templars' story raises about the proper relationship between spiritual and temporal authority, about the corrupting effects of power and wealth, about the fate of idealistic movements in a pragmatic world, remain as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. In their rise from humble origins to international power, and in their sudden fall from grace to destruction, the Knights Templar embodied both the highest aspirations and the tragic limitations of medieval Christendom. As evening light fades over the ruins of Templar castles in the Holy Land, as modern pilgrims visit the churches the Order built across Europe, as scholars continue to uncover new documents and artifacts that illuminate their history, the Knights Templar remain more than historical curiosities. They serve as mirrors reflecting eternal human struggles between idealism and corruption, between service and self-interest, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world. Their white mantles may have burned with their bodies on that March evening in Paris, but the questions they raised and the ideals they represented continue to echo through the centuries, reminders that even the most powerful institutions are fragile, that even the noblest purposes can be corrupted, and that the search for truth about human nature and divine purpose continues across generations, finding new expression in each age, while remaining fundamentally unchanged in its essential concerns. The echoes of eternity that sound in the Templars' story are the echoes of all human striving, the desire to serve something greater than oneself, the struggle to maintain purity in a corrupt world, and the ultimate confrontation with mortality that awaits every individual and every institution. In their 2-century journey from sacred fire to ashes, the Knights Templar became eternal symbols of these universal human experiences, ensuring that their memory would endure long after their physical presence had vanished from the earth. The eternal vigil. In the silence of ancient stone chambers where Templar prayers once echoed, in the shadows of ruined castles that overlook forgotten battlefields, in the hidden corners of modern cities where their round churches still shelter the faithful, something of the Knights Templar endures. Not the men themselves, they lie long buried beneath centuries of dust and legend, but the spirit that moved them, the ideal that inspired them, the eternal questions their existence posed about faith, power, and the human capacity for both greatness and tragedy. The Templar legacy lives on in ways both visible and hidden, practical and mystical, scholarly and popular. It can be found in the legal principles that govern international banking, in the architectural forms that echo their distinctive building style, in the moral codes that attempt to balance spiritual commitment with worldly responsibility. Most profoundly, it persists in the continuing human struggle to reconcile the demands of the sacred with the necessities of the secular. A struggle that gave birth to the order and ultimately consumed it. Standing today in the Temple Church in London, where medieval knights lie carved in stone with their hands folded in eternal prayer, visitors can sense something of what moved those long-dead warriors to abandon comfort and safety for the harsh demands of crusading warfare. The very air seems heavy with memory, with the weight of vows taken and lives given for purposes that transcended personal gain or glory. Here, the Templar ideal achieves its most perfect expression, not in the legends and mysteries that surround the order, but in the simple fact of dedication itself. The modern world, for all its technological sophistication and philosophical complexity, still grapples with the fundamental tensions that shaped Templar history. How does one serve God in a world that often seems indifferent to divine purposes? How does one maintain spiritual purity while engaging with the compromises and corruptions inherent in worldly power? How does one build institutions that serve eternal purposes while operating within temporal limitations? These questions, which drove young noblemen to take Templar vows in the 12th century, remain as challenging today as they were 800 years ago. In hospitals where medical missionaries combine healing with evangelism, in schools where religious communities educate without regard to students' ability to pay, in relief organizations that bring aid to disaster victims regardless of their faith or nationality, the Templar synthesis of spiritual commitment and practical service finds contemporary expression. These modern inheritors of the warrior-monk ideal may not wear white mantles or carry swords, but they embody the same fundamental conviction that animated the original Templars, that faith demands action, that spiritual calling requires worldly engagement, and that service to God must manifest itself in service to humanity. The financial innovations pioneered by the Templars continue to evolve in forms they could never have imagined. Electronic transfers, international credit systems, global investment networks all trace their conceptual ancestry to the Templar treasurers who first recognized that money could move across vast distances more safely and efficiently than physical goods. The modern global economy, for all its complexity and controversy, rests on foundations that medieval monks laid when they developed the first international banking system. The Templars' tragic end serves as a perpetual warning about the corrupting effects of power and the vulnerability of even the most successful institutions. Their destruction by Philip IV demonstrated how quickly political circumstances could change, how ruthlessly temporal authority could move against spiritual claims, and how easily public opinion could be manipulated by determined propaganda campaigns. These lessons remain relevant in any age when powerful institutions claim special authority or exemption from normal accountability. Educational institutions worldwide invoke the Templar example in their mission statements and founding documents, seeing in the Order's commitment to preserving and transmitting knowledge a model for their own work. Universities, libraries, and research centers that claim Templar inspiration recognize that the pursuit of truth requires the same combination of disciplined dedication and institutional protection that characterized the medieval order at its best. The art and architecture associated with the Templars continue to inspire contemporary creators who find in their aesthetic principles resources for modern expression. The mathematical precision of their geometric designs, the symbolic richness of their iconographic programs, the integration of spiritual purpose with functional necessity, all provide models for artists, architects, and designers seeking to create work that serves both practical and transcendent purposes. Archaeological work at former Templar sites continues to yield new insights into their daily lives, their technological innovations, and their cultural impact. Excavations reveal not legendary treasures or mystical artifacts, but evidence of remarkable organizational efficiency, technological sophistication, and cultural adaptation. The reality of Templar achievement, documented through careful scientific investigation, proves more impressive than the fantasies that surround their memory. International law and diplomatic practice preserve elements of the Templar legacy in concepts of extraterritoriality, diplomatic immunity, and transnational organization. The modern notion that some institutions can operate across national boundaries while maintaining their own internal governance owes much to medieval precedents established by the military orders. International organizations like the United Nations, the Red Cross, and various charitable foundations operate on principles that would have been familiar to Templar administrators. Religious communities continue to find inspiration in the Templar example of combining contemplative spirituality with active service. Modern military chaplains, missionary organizations, and faith-based relief agencies draw on the tradition of warrior monks who sought to serve God through engagement with worldly challenges rather than withdrawal from them. The tension between spiritual commitment and practical necessity that defined Templar existence remains central to contemporary religious life. The mystery surrounding the Templars' initiation ceremonies and internal practices continues to fascinate scholars and popular writers alike. While no credible evidence supports the more exotic theories about their secret knowledge or hidden treasures, the documented fact that they maintained private rituals and restricted information demonstrates their understanding that some truths cannot be casually shared or easily understood. This recognition of the sacred nature of certain knowledge resonates with modern scientific and spiritual communities that guard their own specialized insights. The Templars' international character provides precedents for contemporary discussions about globalization, cultural exchange, and transnational identity. Their ability to maintain unified purpose while adapting to diverse local conditions offers models for modern organizations seeking to balance global coherence with regional responsiveness. Their success in creating loyalty that transcended national boundaries suggests possibilities for human cooperation that remain relevant in an interconnected world. The technology that enabled the Templars' communication networks, couriers, coded messages, standardized procedures, has evolved into the digital systems that connect the modern world. Yet the fundamental challenges they faced in maintaining organizational coherence across vast distances while preserving security and ensuring accuracy remain essentially unchanged. Modern cybersecurity experts and international corporations grapple with the same basic problems that confronted Templar administrators 7 centuries ago. The Templars' agricultural and industrial innovations contributed to medieval technological development in ways that influenced subsequent economic growth. Their mills, foundries, and workshops served as laboratories for practical experimentation and technological transfer. Their systematic approach to land management and resource utilization provided models for sustainable development that remain relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. The liturgical traditions associated with the Templars continue to influence Christian worship, particularly in communities that emphasize the relationship between spiritual devotion and practical service. Their integration of military and monastic elements in daily prayer, their emphasis on discipline and regularity in religious observance, and their understanding of work as worship provide resources for contemporary Christian communities seeking to balance contemplation with action. The Templars' martyrdom, both in the Holy Land and in the fires of Philip IV's persecution, established precedents for understanding how faithful people respond to persecution and death. Their example of maintaining commitment to principle, even under extreme pressure, provides inspiration for subsequent generations facing similar challenges. The courage of Jacques de Molay and his brothers in their final moments continues to inspire those who find themselves called to witness for truth against overwhelming opposition. As the modern world struggles with questions about the proper relationship between religious faith and political power, between individual conscience and institutional authority, between local tradition and global integration, the Templar example offers both inspiration and warning. Their remarkable achievements demonstrate what can be accomplished when spiritual purpose combines with practical skill and institutional discipline. Their tragic destruction reveals how quickly success can breed enemies, and how vulnerable even the most powerful organizations remain to determined opposition. In quiet chapels where their round arches frame modern prayers, in university libraries where their financial records inform contemporary economic theory, in hospitals where their model of service continues to inspire healing work, in the ongoing human struggle to create institutions that serve eternal purposes while engaging temporal challenges, the Knights Templar maintain their eternal vigil. They stand guard not over physical treasures or geographic territories, but over the enduring human conviction that life can have meaning beyond material success, that power can serve purposes greater than self-interest, and that even in a fallen world, glimpses of redemption remain possible for those with courage to seek them. The white mantles have long since turned to dust. The red crosses have faded from their fabric. The swords have rusted in forgotten graves. But the spirit that clothed itself in those mantles, that blazed forth in those crosses, that wielded those swords in service of divine purpose, continues its watch across the centuries. In every generation that seeks to balance faith with reason, service with survival, idealism with pragmatism, the Templars' vigil continues, their example bearing witness to both the possibility of transcendence and the persistence of human failure. The temple they built was not made of stone, but of human lives dedicated to purposes greater than themselves. Though the builders are gone, though the external forms have changed beyond recognition, though the very name of their order has become more legend than history, the temple itself endures, not in any physical location, but in the continuing human quest for meaning, service, and connection with the divine that moves the sun and the other stars. In this eternal seeking, the Knights Templar have achieved the only immortality that matters. They live on in the aspirations of all who seek to serve something greater than themselves, who strive to build something more lasting than their own brief lives, who maintain hope that even in the darkest hours before dawn, the light will come again.